The stagecoach jolted to a stop with a groan of wood and leather, and Elliot Crane nearly lost his grip on the battered suitcase wedged between his knees. Dust billowed through the open window, thick and golden in the late September light, and for a long moment he simply sat there, listening to the horses snort and stamp, watching the particles drift like something sacred and ancient suspended in the air. Copper Bluff, Montana. The end of the line. The absolute end. He stepped down from the coach onto ground that felt different from any ground he had ever stood on. Harder, older, the kind of earth that did not care about the man standing on it. Behind him, the driver was already unloading luggage, tossing bags and trunks onto the wooden platform with the careless efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. Elliot caught his own suitcase before it hit the ground. Leather scuffed at the corners, the brass clasp bent from when he had dropped it running for the train in Chicago. Inside it held everything he owned in the world. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, a ledger book, a volume of Wordsworth with a cracked spine, and a letter folded so many times the creases had worn through the paper advertising a position as a mail-order husband for a family named Hargrove in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory. He stood on the platform and looked around. Copper Bluff was not really a town. It was more of an argument between civilization and the wilderness was winning. A single main street stretched between a general store, a saloon, a feedlot, a building that might have been a church or might have been a courthouse, and a squat wooden structure with the word hotel painted on it in letters that were slowly peeling themselves free from the facade. Beyond the buildings, the mountains rose like the walls of a cathedral, massive and indifferent, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of autumn. No one was waiting for him. He had expected this might happen. The letter had said someone would meet him at the stage stop, but letters traveled slowly out here, and plans changed and people forgot. He could be patient. He sat on his suitcase and waited. 1 hour passed. The sun moved. The shadows lengthened. A dog trotted across the main street, paused to look at him with an expression of profound disinterest, and continued on its way. 2 hours. The stagecoach driver had long since disappeared into the saloon. A group of miners emerged from the general store, glanced at Elliot with a casual suspicion. Frontier people reserved for strangers, and moved on. By the time the light began to turn the color of copper, Elliot understood that no one was coming. He picked up his suitcase and walked to the saloon. The interior was everything he expected and nothing like it. Dark wood, low ceiling, the smell of whiskey and tobacco, and something that might have been beef stew. 4 men sat at a corner table playing cards. A woman in a faded blue dress was wiping down the bar. Behind her, a heavy-set man with a gray beard was reading a newspaper that looked to be at least 3 weeks old. Elliot approached the bar. "Excuse me, I am looking for the Hargrove family. I was told they lived somewhere in the Bitterroot Valley." The bartender looked up from his newspaper. His eyes were small and sharp, the eyes of a man who had cataloged every stranger who ever walked through his door and remembered each one. "Hargrove." He said the name like he was tasting something. "The Hargrove girls, you mean?" "Girls." The bartender set down his paper. "Old Hank Hargrove died 2 years back. Left 3 daughters up on that mountain." He studied Elliot with frank curiosity. "You the mail-order husband?" Elliot felt heat rise to his face. The advertisement said the family needed someone who could read and write and keep accounts. The bartender laughed, a short, hard bark that held no actual amusement. "Mister, I do not know what that advertisement told you, but those 3 girls up there are wilder than anything with fur and teeth in these mountains. Their daddy raised them like sons. They ride harder, shoot straighter, and curse louder than most men in this territory." He leaned forward. "Last fellow who tried to court the oldest one came back missing a hat and most of his dignity. She set his horse loose and told him to walk home." Elliot swallowed. "How do I get there?" The bartender stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at a dog chasing a porcupine. 4 hours up the mountain trail. Take a left at the Split Oak, follow the creek until it forks, then head north until you see the house or you fall off a cliff." He paused. "I would wait until morning if I were you. I have been waiting 2 months." Elliot picked up his suitcase. "I believe I have waited long enough." He rented a mule from the feedlot, a gray sway-backed animal with an expression of bottomless contempt that seemed to be directed at Elliot specifically. The trail wound upward through pine forests so thick the fading light barely penetrated. The air changed as he climbed, thinner, colder, sharper. It smelled of resin and stone, and something electric like the promise of weather. Elliot Crane had grown up in Philadelphia. He had spent his entire adult life in rooms with walls and ceilings and furniture that stayed where you put it. He had walked on cobblestones and brick and polished wood floors. He had never in his life been truly alone in wilderness, and the weight of it pressed against him from every direction, vast and ancient, and utterly unconcerned with his existence. He thought about turning back. He thought about it with every switchback in the trail, every moment the mule paused to consider whether it would rather continue uphill or simply throw its rider into the ravine below. But he did not turn back because there was nothing to turn back to. Philadelphia was gone. Not the city itself, of course. Cities did not vanish, but the life he had lived there had evaporated like water on hot stone. He could still see it if he closed his eyes. The office at Alderton and Associates, his desk by the window, the neat columns of numbers in his ledger books, the satisfaction of accounts that balanced to the penny. He had been good at that work, more than good. He had been precise, thorough, the kind of man whose attention to detail meant that nothing slipped through. His employer, Judge Howard Crane, no relation despite the shared surname, had trusted him completely. And Elliot had repaid that trust by testifying in court that the judge's financial records contained irregularities consistent with embezzlement. He had not lied. That was the thing that haunted him. Every number he cited was real. Every discrepancy he identified was there in the ledger in black ink, undeniable. He had simply reported what he saw. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that someone else had altered those numbers before they ever reached his desk. Someone had turned Judge Howard Crane's clean accounts into a tapestry of manufactured guilt, and Elliot had been the unwitting instrument of that manufactured evidence. The jury acquitted the judge, barely, but the damage was catastrophic and complete. Judge Crane's reputation was destroyed, his health collapsed. And Elliot, the star witness, whose testimony had nearly convicted an innocent man, found every door in Philadelphia closed. His fiancée Margaret returned his ring with a note that was 3 sentences long and contained enough finality to last a lifetime. His friends, such as they were, vanished like smoke. His mother died of diphtheria that winter. His father and younger sister followed within the month. 3 funerals in 30 days. Elliot stood in the Philadelphia cemetery in January rain and felt the last threads connecting him to his life snap one by one. He had found the advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper that someone had left on a bench in the train station. Wanted a man of good character and education. Must read, write, and keep accounts. Hard work and fair treatment guaranteed. Hargrove family, Bitterroot Valley, Montana territory. He had answered it the same day. Now 4 hours up a mountain trail in the gathering dark, riding a mule that hated him, he began to question whether desperation was a reliable guide for life decisions. The house appeared so suddenly it seemed to materialize from the darkness itself. One moment there was nothing but trees and shadow, and the next there was a clearing, a split-rail fence, a barn, and a 2-story log house with lamplight glowing in the downstairs windows. Smoke rose from the chimney. Horses moved in the corral. It was, despite everything, beautiful. The rifle shot that kicked up dirt 3 feet in front of his mule was considerably less beautiful. Elliot's entire body went rigid. The mule, with the unshakable calm of an animal that has survived worse, simply stopped, walking, and lowered its head to chew on a tuft of grass. "Stop right there. State your name." The voice came from the porch. Female. Hard. The kind of voice that expected obedience and usually got it. Elliot raised both hands, one of which was still holding the mule's reins, which made the gesture somewhat less dignified than he intended. "Elliot Crane, from Philadelphia. I answered the advertisement in the newspaper." Silence. Long silence. The kind of silence that stretches and stretches until you begin to wonder whether the person holding the rifle has decided to simply wait until you die of anxiety. Then a second voice from an upstairs window. "Also female. Also not friendly. What advertisement?" "The mail order. Husband advertisement." Elliot's voice cracked on the word husband, which did not help his credibility. "The Hargrove family. Someone placed an advertisement looking for a man who could read and write and keep accounts." More silence. Then the sound of rapid, urgent whispering. Elliot could not make out the words, but the tone was clear. Confusion, suspicion, Anger. The porch voice spoke again. We did not place any advertisement. The words landed like stones. Elliot sat on the mule in the Montana dark and felt the ground shift beneath him for the second time in 2 years. Then what he began, a third voice cut in from somewhere to his left near the barn, a younger voice sharp with impatience. Jess, if somebody faked an ad in our name, that is a problem we need to figure out. But we cannot figure it out if you shoot him first. I am not going to shoot him. Probably. That probably did not fill Elliot with confidence. The woman on the porch descended the steps. As she moved into the edge of the lamplight, spilling from the windows, Elliot saw her clearly for the first time. She was tall for a woman, maybe 5'7", with a build that spoke of years of physical work. Not delicate, not soft, but strong in the way that mountains were strong, in the way that timber was strong. Her hair was dark chestnut brown, pulled back from her face with what appeared to be a strip of leather, and her eyes, even in the dim light, were the color of deep pine forests. She held the Winchester with the casual ease of someone who considered it an extension of her own body. Jessamine Hargrove. She did not offer her hand. People call me Jess. She studied him the way a hawk studies movement on the ground below. Who sent you? No one sent me. I answered an advertisement. Elliot slowly lowered his hands. If you did not place it, then I have traveled a very long way for nothing, and I apologize for the intrusion. The woman from the upstairs window appeared at the front door. Shorter than Jess, slighter with dark hair shot through with streaks that the sun had turned to gold. Her eyes were amber hazel, watchful and intelligent. She moved with the quiet economy of someone accustomed to going unnoticed. I am Wren, she said. She looked at the Mo, at Elliot's suitcase, at his dust-covered Eastern clothes. You really came from Philadelphia, I really did. The third sister emerged from beside the barn. She was the youngest, that much was immediately clear, and she carried herself like a lit fuse. Auburn hair wild around her face, storm gray eyes that held a permanent challenge, and a wood-splitting axe resting against one shoulder with the kind of casual menace that suggested she knew exactly what message it sent. Coraline, she said. Cora. And if you are lying about that advertisement, I will know. I am not lying. Elliot dismounted from the mule, or rather, the mule shifted sideways, and Elliot slid off in a manner that was technically dismounting but practically closer to falling. He caught himself, straightened his vest, and tried to recover whatever shreds of dignity remained. I have the advertisement here. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, very aware of the rifle still pointed in his general direction, and produced the folded newspaper clipping. Jess took it, held it near the window light, and read. Her expression did not change, which Elliot was beginning to understand was simply how her face worked. This is our names, she said. Our address. Even Pa's name, and Pa has been dead 2 years. She looked at her sisters. Someone wrote this pretending to be us. Someone wanted a stranger to come here. Why, Wren said quietly. It was not a question directed at anyone present. It was the kind of question that opens a door into a dark room. The question hung in the cold mountain air. 3 sisters and one bewildered accountant from Philadelphia standing in a clearing, surrounded by 100 miles of wilderness, and none of them with an answer. Jess made the decision. You sleep in the barn, door stays open. Wren watches from the window. If you try to enter this house, I will shoot you in both knees, and then we will have a conversation about your intentions. She paused. Are we clear? Remarkably clear. Elliot picked up his suitcase. And Miss Hargrove, for what it is worth, I am sorry for the intrusion. Jess did not reply. She turned and walked back into the house, and the door closed behind her with a sound that was not quite a slam, but was certainly not a welcome. The barn was warmer than Elliot expected. 2 horses watched him from their stalls with the tolerant disinterest of animals that had seen stranger things than a city man making a bed from horse blankets. He found a relatively clean spot in the hayloft, spread his coat, and lay down with his suitcase as a pillow. Above him, through a gap in the barn roof, he could see stars. More stars than he had ever seen, more stars than he knew existed. The sky was so vast and deep and full of light that it seemed impossible it was the same sky that hung over Philadelphia. He thought about Judge Howard Crane lying in some hospital in the East the last Elliot had heard. Sick, broken, innocent. He thought about Margaret and her 3-sentence letter. He thought about the empty rooms of his family home sold to pay for funerals. And then he thought about the three women in that house, armed and suspicious and alone on a mountain, and someone out there who had wanted him to find them. He did not sleep well. Morning arrived with the sound of a rooster that seemed to be screaming directly into Elliot's ear and a boot nudging his rib cage. "Get up." Cora stood over him, backlit by dawn light pouring through the barn door. She held a wooden bucket in one hand. "Milk the cow." She set the bucket down with a thump. "If you know how." He did not know how, but he was not going to say that to the girl with the axe. He picked up the bucket and followed her to the small pen behind the barn, where a brown and white cow regarded him with an expression of deep skepticism. 20 minutes later, Elliot had been kicked twice, head-butted once, and produced approximately half a cup of milk that was mostly foam. Cora, leaning against the fence, watched the entire performance with an expression that progressed from contempt through disbelief into something that was almost, but not quite, amusement. "City boy," she said, "you really cannot do anything, can you? I can balance a ledger to the penny, I can read legal documents in 3 languages, and I make excellent coffee." Cora raised an eyebrow. "We do not have coffee. We have chicory root boiled in creek water. Then I have nothing to offer." But by mid-morning he had found something. The sisters were outside working. Jess had ridden out at dawn to check on the cattle spread across the upper pastures. Cora was in the corral with a half-wild Mustang she had caught somewhere. The two of them engaged in a battle of wills that appeared to be roughly even. Wren was repairing a section of fence on the property's eastern edge, her movements efficient and practiced. Elliot, with nothing useful to do outside and a strong desire to avoid being kicked by any more animals, went inside the house. It was well built. Simple but solid, the kind of house that a careful man had built to last. The main room held a stone fireplace, a long wooden table, shelves of supplies. Everything was clean but worn. The kind of clean that came from effort, not luxury. What drew his attention was the desk in the corner. It was buried under paper. Letters, receipts, official-looking documents, with seals and stamps and all piled in a drift that suggested no one had organized them in a very long time. Maybe years. Elliot's hands itched. Organization was not merely a skill for him. It was a compulsion, a need as fundamental as breathing. He could no more look at a pile of unsorted documents than a musician could ignore an untuned piano. He sat down and began to sort. An hour later, he had separated the papers into categories. Personal correspondence in one pile, supply receipts in another, and in the third pile, the one that made his stomach tighten, official documents from the county tax office. He read them twice to be sure. The Hargrove family owed 3 years of back taxes on their 800-acre property. The total amount was $340. The deadline for payment was 60 days away. If the taxes were not paid, the land would be seized and sold at public auction. But that was not what made his hands go cold. The tax assessments were wrong, not slightly wrong, not the kind of minor computational error that crept into government paperwork like mice into grain stores. These were deliberately, systematically inflated. The assessed value per acre was 40% higher than comparable properties in the same valley. Someone had calculated the tax on land valued at $6 per acre when every surrounding rounding parcel was assessed at $3.50 to $4. Someone had intentionally made the Hargrove tax bill impossible to pay. Elliot stared at the numbers and felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same tightness he had felt sitting in that Philadelphia courtroom, looking at columns of figures that did not add up. He found Jess when she returned at noon. She was unsaddling her horse, her face flushed from the ride, her movements sharp with the focused energy of someone who had been thinking hard about something for hours. "Miss Hargrove, I need to speak with you." She did not look up. "If this is about the advertisement again." "It is about your taxes." That stopped her. She turned slowly. "What about our taxes? You owe $340 to the county. The deadline is 60 days. If you do not pay, you lose this land." The color drained from her face. "How do you know that I read the documents on the desk?" Elliot held them out. "But that is not the worst of it. The assessments are wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone at the county tax office has inflated the value of your land by 40%. You should owe closer to $200, not $340. Jess took the papers. She stared at them for a long time. Her jaw was working, the muscles tight and rigid, and Elliot understood that she was not confused. She was furious. Pa always handled the paperwork, she said finally. Her voice was flat, controlled the voice of someone holding something enormous behind a very thin wall. After he died, she stopped. I cannot read legal documents. None of us can. Pa was going to teach us, but she stopped again. Wren appeared from behind the barn, drawn by something in her sister's posture. What happened? And when Elliot explained, when he laid out the numbers and the discrepancies in the 60-day deadline, Wren's face went through the same transformation as Jess's, from confusion to understanding to a cold, quiet anger. Cora's reaction was different. Cora's reaction was loud. We sell the cattle. We pay it. Done. Elliot shook his head. Cattle prices have dropped. You would need to sell most of the herd to cover $340, and that would leave you without stock to rebuild next year. But more importantly, and he paused, choosing his words carefully, the wrong amount is the problem. If you pay the inflated bill, you validate the false assessment. Next year, they will charge you even more. And the year after that, until you cannot pay at all. Then what do? Wren asked. We challenge the assessment. Legally. File a formal dispute with the county tax office, demand a reassessment based on comparable properties. Elliot looked at the sisters. But I need to understand why someone would target your family specifically. Who wants your land badly enough to commit tax fraud? The silence that followed told him everything. It was Jess who spoke. Silas Penderton. She said the name the way you might say the name of a disease. Factual, clinical, and underneath barely contained fury. They told him the story in pieces. Jess provided the facts clipped and precise. Wren filled in the details that Jess omitted, the emotional context, the human cost. Cora punctuated with anger. Silas Penderton had arrived in the Bitterroot Valley 2 years ago. A railroad investor from Denver, well-dressed, well-spoken, with money enough to make people listen and power enough to make them comply. He was buying land for a new rail line from Missoula to Butte. Most ranchers had sold. Those who resisted found life becoming difficult in small cumulative ways. Fences broken, cattle scattered, wells poisoned. The kind of misfortunes that could be coincidence or could be something else entirely. The Hargroves had refused to sell from the beginning. He came here 3 times, Jess said. Her voice was stone. First time he was polite, offered fair money. Pa said no. Second time he brought a lawyer, offered more money, but with conditions that would have given Penderton control of the water rights. Pa said no again. Third time, Cora said, her voice cracking, the barn caught fire. There was a pause, the kind of pause that holds a wound. Pa was fixing the roof of the barn when it happened. Wren said quietly, the support beam broke. He fell 20 feet, broke his back. He lived 3 months after that. Jess continued, could not walk, could not ride. The man who had climbed every peak in these mountains lay in bed and stared at the ceiling until he died. I am sorry, Elliot said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Before he died, Wren said, Pa told me something. She looked at her sisters, then at Elliot. He said, never sell the land. He said there is something under the ground that Penderton wants. Something more valuable than any railroad. What he did not say, he could barely speak by then. She swallowed, but he was certain. He said the land was worth more than Penderton would ever admit. The words settled into Elliot's mind like stones dropping into still water. He thought about the inflated tax assessments designed to make the Hargroves lose their land for failure to pay. He thought about the suspicious barn fire, the convenient accident, the death of a man who would not sell. He thought about a railroad investor who wanted land not for rails, but for something hidden beneath the surface. And he thought with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his life reading numbers, that the pattern here was one he had seen before. I need to go to town, he said. The next morning, Elliot rode the rented mule back down the mountain trail to Copper Bluff. His mission was straightforward. File a formal challenge to the Hargrove tax assessment at the county office. Request copies of comparable property assessments for the valley. Begin building a paper trail. The county tax office occupied a small room in the back of the courthouse building. A thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers sat behind a desk piled with ledgers. He looked up when Elliot entered, and his expression immediately shifted into something guarded. Help you, Guslickit. Place the Hargrove tax documents on the desk. I am filing a formal challenge to this assessment on behalf of the Hargrove family. The per-acre valuation is 40% above comparable properties in the Bitterroot Valley. I am requesting a reassessment. The clerk barely glanced at the papers. Assessment stands. County policy. County policy does not permit fraudulent valuations. Elliot kept his voice level. I would like to review the assessment records for all properties within a 10-mile radius of the Hargrove parcel. Those are public records. The clerk's jaw tightened. I will need to check with my supervisor. Public records do not require supervisory approval. They stared at each other across the desk. The clerk looked away first. He produced a thick folder and set it down with deliberate reluctance. Elliot opened it and began to read. His trained eye moved across the numbers with practiced efficiency, absorbing patterns, identifying anomalies. Within 15 minutes, he had confirmed what he suspected. Every property that Penderton had purchased was assessed at a low value. Every property that had not sold to Penderton was assessed at an inflated value. The discrepancy was systematic, deliberate, the work of someone who understood exactly how to use tax law as a weapon. He was 3 pages into a land deed when a shadow fell across the desk. Mr. Crane, what a pleasant surprise. Elliot looked up. The man standing in the doorway was tall, thin, immaculately dressed in a tailored dark suit that looked absurdly out of place in a Montana County office. Sharp features, eyes like glass, a smile that was technically present on his face but had nothing to do with warmth or welcome. Marcus Vane, the man said, extending a hand that Elliot did not take. Legal counsel to Mr. Silas Penderton. I believe we have matters to discuss. I was not aware we had any business together. Vane settled into the chair across from Elliot as if he owned it. Perhaps not directly, but you are involving yourself in the affairs of the Hargrove family, and Mr. Penderton takes a keen interest in the welfare of his neighbors. Is that what he calls it? Vane's smile did not flicker. You know, Mr. Crane, I took the liberty of making some inquiries about you. Fascinating background. Accountant at Alderton and Associates in Philadelphia. Star witness in the trial of Judge Howard Crane. He tilted his head, and then nothing. No employment, no references, just a man who disappeared. Until now. Elliot felt the familiar cold settle into his stomach. The cold that came with being seen, being known, being exposed. What is your point, Mr. Vane? My point is that you have a complicated history, a history that could be interpreted in various ways depending on who is telling the story. Vane leaned forward. If, for example, someone were to present evidence that your testimony in the Crane trial was based on falsified documents, well, that would make your testimony itself potentially fraudulent. Perjury charges, even here in Montana. If the documents were falsified, then I was a victim, not a perpetrator. Certainly. But trials are expensive, time-consuming, unpleasant. Vane reached into his jacket and produced a card. Mr. Penderton is a reasonable man. He suggests you leave Montana, forget the Hargrove family, and accept $200 for your traveling expenses. Elliot took the card, looked at it, looked at Vane, and felt something shift inside him. Not fear, something older and harder. The same feeling he had felt standing in that Philadelphia cemetery in the January rain, watching the last handful of dirt fall on his sister's coffin. He was so very tired of being afraid. I will think about it, Elliot said, and stood and walked out of the county office with the folder of public records tucked under his arm. He was halfway down the main street when he realized his hands were shaking. He stopped, pressed them flat against his thighs, and forced himself to breathe. Vane knew about Philadelphia. Vane knew about the trial, which meant Penderton had investigated him, which meant someone had told Penderton that Elliot Crane had arrived in Copper Bluff and was staying at the Hargrove Ranch. The bartender, the feedlot owner, the stagecoach driver, any one of them. In a town this small, information moved at the speed of gossip, and gossip moved at the speed of fear. Elliot mounted his mule and rode back up the mountain with the public records and a growing certainty that he was walking into something far larger and far more dangerous than a simple tax dispute. He told the sisters everything. They sat around the kitchen table as the evening light turned the mountains gold, and Elliot laid out the documents and the numbers and the patterns and the threat from Marcus Vane. Jess's reaction was cold fury directed partly at Penderton, partly at herself, and partly at Elliot. This is exactly why I did not want outsiders involved. Now they know about you. Now they are watching. But Wren was already looking at the numbers, her amber eyes moving across the columns with a hunger that surprised Elliot. "Show me," she said. "Show me how you read these." He showed her. He explained assessed values and comparable properties in tax lien procedures, and Wren absorbed it all with the fierce concentration of someone who had been hungry for knowledge her entire life and had only just found the table. "If Penderton is inflating taxes to force people to sell," she said slowly, "then he is doing it to everyone who has not sold yet, not just us." "Correct. Which means every rancher in this valley is a potential ally. They just do not know it yet." "Also correct." Cora, who had been pacing the room like a caged animal, stopped. "So what do? We build a case," Elliot said. "We document every fraudulent assessment. We gather testimony from every rancher who has been pressured, threatened, or cheated. And we take it to someone with the authority to act." Jess shook her head. "The sheriff is in Penderton's pocket. Everyone knows it. Then we go over his head. Federal marshal, territorial governor, someone who does not owe Penderton anything." "That is a long road," Jess said. "It is the only road that leads somewhere worth going." The room was quiet. Outside, the last light was fading from the peaks. An owl called somewhere in the darkness, a sound so lonely it seemed to come from the earth itself. "All right," Jess said finally, "but we do this my way, on my land, under my rules." She looked at Elliot with those deep green eyes. "And if you get any of us killed, I will make sure you regret it for whatever time you have left." "Understood." She stood. "You have 1 week. Prove you are not useless." Elliot spent the next 7 days learning that the gap between what he could do and what this land demanded was approximately the width of the Grand Canyon. He could not ride. The mule had been one thing. The actual horses the Hargroves kept were another matter entirely. On his first attempt, Jess's bay gelding walked calmly for 30 seconds, then executed a sideways maneuver that deposited Elliot in a pile of manure so precisely targeted it seemed intentional. Cora laughed so hard she had to sit down. Even Wren, normally diplomatic, pressed her hand over her mouth. He could not chop wood. The axe, which seemed weightless in Cora's hands, felt like it weighed 60 pounds in his. His first swing missed the log entirely and embedded the blade in the stump so deeply it took him 10 minutes to work it free. He could not rope cattle. He could not mend fences. He could not read animal tracks or weather signs or any of the 1,000 small signals that the land offered to those who knew its language. But he could cook. On the second morning, he woke before dawn, found the kitchen, and made breakfast from what was available. Biscuits from flour and lard bacon, from the smokehouse eggs from the chicken coop, and the chicory coffee that Cora had mentioned. He added a pinch of cinnamon he found in a jar on the shelf, and when the sisters came downstairs to the smell of food, they stopped in the doorway and stared. "Where did you learn to cook?" Wren asked. "My mother was a nurse. She worked long hours. I learned to have dinner ready when she came home." Elliot set plates on the table. After she died, cooking was the only thing that still felt like taking care of someone. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Less hostile, more curious, and he could organize. By the end of the first week, he had sorted every piece of paper in the house. He had created a filing system for tax documents, correspondence, and property records. He had written and sent a formal tax challenge to the county office. He had drafted letters to the Territorial Tax Commission requesting a review of all Bitterroot Valley assessments. He had balanced the household accounts and identified $40 in overpayments to the general store in Copper Bluff that could be reclaimed. Each evening he sat by the fireplace and read aloud from his Wordsworth. He had not planned this. The first night he had simply been reading to himself, and Wren had drifted closer, then Cora, and finally Jess, who sat in the far corner pretending to clean her rifle but who had not actually moved the cleaning rod in 20 minutes. He did not comment on it. He simply read. On the 7th day, the night before his deadline, Elliot was sitting on the porch reviewing the tax documents by lamplight when Jess appeared. She sat beside him, not close, but not at the far end of the porch either, a middle distance that felt deliberate. "You can stay," she said. It was not warm. It was not effusive. It was 3 words delivered in the same tone she might use to tell a horse it could have an extra handful of oats. But Elliot understood what those 3 words had cost her. He understood the pride she was swallowing, the control she was releasing, the trust she was extending to a stranger who had arrived uninvited and unannounced on her mountain. "Thank you," he said. They sat in silence for a while. The stars overhead were staggering, a river of light flowing across the black sky. Then Jess said, "There is something you should know. Riders have been watching the ranch 2 nights now. They stay in the tree line. They do not come closer, but they are there." Elliot felt the cold again. Penderton maybe, or maybe the person who placed that false advertisement. She turned to look at him, and in the lamplight, her face was all sharp angles and shadow, fierce and beautiful, and utterly unafraid. "Whoever it is," she said, "they wanted you here. The question is why?" A sound from the edge of the clearing. Both of them turned. Jess's hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Elliot's hand went to nothing because he did not have a weapon, which seemed like a significant oversight. A figure emerged from the tree line, hands raised, no weapon visible, moving slowly, carefully, the way a man moves when he knows there is a rifle pointed at his chest. He was old, 60 at least, maybe more. Thin, gaunt clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been larger. He walked with the uneven gait of someone who had been traveling hard and eating little. When the lamplight found his face, Elliot felt the ground drop out from under him. He knew that face. He had seen it across a courtroom in Philadelphia. He had seen it in his nightmares for 2 years. Robert Stillwell, the law clerk, the man who had forged the documents that destroyed Judge Howard Crane, the man who had vanished after the trial and had not been seen since. Stillwell stopped at the edge of the porch light. His eyes found Elliot and held. "Mr. Crane," he said, and his voice was rough, broken, the voice of a man who had been running for a very long time. "Please, I need your help. I am the one who placed the advertisement. I needed you to come here, because Silas Penderton is doing the same thing here that was done in Philadelphia. And this time I have proof." The mountain night pressed in around them, vast and cold and full of things that were about to change everything. The rifle in Jess's hands did not waver. It stayed pointed at the center of Robert Stillwell's chest with the steady patience of a woman who had spent her life aiming at things that move faster than old men. "Give me one reason," she said. Stillwell kept his hands raised. His fingers trembled in the lamplight. Not from cold, from something deeper. The kind of trembling that comes from carrying a weight too long. Elliot found his voice. "I know this man." Jess did not look away from Stillwell. Friend or enemy? Neither. Elliot's throat was dry. "He is the man who destroyed my life." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or revelation. Cora appeared at the side of the house, axe in hand, drawn by the voices. Wren materialized in the doorway behind them, a lantern held high, its light throwing long shadows across the clearing. Stillwell spoke into that silence with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that his next words might be his last. "Everything you just said is true, Mr. Crane. I forged the documents that led to Judge Howard Crane's trial. I manipulated the ledgers before they reached your desk. You testified honestly about numbers that I had falsified." His voice cracked. "But I did not do it alone, and I did not do it willingly." Elliot stepped forward. His body was rigid, every muscle locked against the flood of emotion threatening to break through. 2 years. 2 years he had lived with the guilt of having nearly condemned an innocent man. 2 years of wondering whether the numbers he reported had been real or manufactured. And here stood the answer, thin and broken and begging for help on a Montana porch. "Who?" Elliot said. The word came out like something torn. "A federal judge named Aldrich Whitfield." Stillwell's hands lowered slowly. "He ordered me to alter the records. When I hesitated, he threatened my family, my wife, my daughter. He said if I did not cooperate, he would ensure they suffered for my disobedience." His eyes were wet, so I cooperated. And then I ran, and I have been running ever since. Jess's rifle had not moved. Wren set the lantern on the porch rail and crossed her arms. Cora shifted the axe from one hand to the other. "Why here?" Wren asked. "Of all the places you could run, why come to our mountain?" "Because Silas Penderton is Whitfield's partner." Stillwell looked at each of them in turn. The same scheme, the same methods. Forged documents, manipulated records, intimidation, violence. What they did in Philadelphia with courtrooms and legal maneuvers, they are doing here with land deeds and tax assessments. He paused. And when I realized what Penderton was doing to the families in this valley, I knew I could not run anymore. "Pretty words," Jess said. From a man who admits he is a liar and a forger. I am both of those things. Stillwell did not flinch. But I am also the only person alive who can prove what Whitfield and Penderton have done, because I kept records. He reached slowly into his coat. Jess's finger tightened on the trigger. Stillwell froze. Inside pocket, he said carefully, a notebook, nothing else. Cora stepped forward, pulled the coat open, and extracted a leather-bound notebook thick with pages, the binding cracked and stained from travel. She handed it to Elliot. He opened it. The handwriting was small, precise, the handwriting of a man trained in legal documentation. Dates, names, transaction amounts, account numbers. Page after page of meticulous records stretching back 2 years. Elliot's trained eye moved across the entries. His breath shortened. This was not the rambling confession of a guilty man. This was evidence. Systematic, detailed, damning evidence. Every forged document I created for Whitfield in Philadelphia, Stillwell said. Every fraudulent land transaction I processed for Penderton in Montana. Real prices versus filed prices. Payments from Penderton to Whitfield. Correspondence I copied before delivering. He swallowed. I knew someday I would need to prove what happened, so I wrote it all down. Wren had moved to Elliot's shoulder and was reading over it. Some of these signatures match the tax documents you found, she said quietly. Same handwriting, same notary marks. Because I forged those too. Stillwell's voice was barely audible. The Hargrove tax assessments, the inflated valuations, all of it was done on Penderton's orders, processed through Whitfield's authority. The notebook trembled in Elliot's hands. He was holding proof, not just proof of Penderton's land fraud, but proof that Judge Howard Crane had been framed. Proof that the scandal in Philadelphia had been manufactured from the beginning. Proof that could restore everything that had been taken from an innocent man. And an innocent man was dying. Judge Crane, Elliot said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. This proves he was innocent. He was always innocent. Stillwell met Elliot's eyes. I am sorry, Mr. Crane. I know what my actions cost you. I know what they cost him. I cannot undo any of it, but I can try to make it right. The porch fell silent. The wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like breathing. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called its lonely question. Jess lowered the rifle. Not all the way, just enough. He sleeps in the barn, she said. Under guard. If he moves wrong, if he breathes wrong, I shoot him. She looked at her sisters. We vote in the morning. The vote was 2-1. Cora wanted him to stay because he knew about their father's death. Wren wanted him to stay because the evidence appeared genuine. Jess voted to send him away and was outvoted for the first time Elliot could remember. She accepted it with the grim silence of a woman who understood democracy but did not enjoy it. Over the next 3 days, Elliot and Wren worked side by side at the kitchen table, cross-referencing Stillwell's notebook against the county tax records Elliot had obtained. They worked in a rhythm that surprised them both, Elliot identifying numerical discrepancies, while Wren mapped the physical properties on a hand-drawn chart of the valley. The picture that emerged was devastating. 12 ranch sales in 18 months. Everyone to the same shell company registered under a name that traced back to Penderton. Everyone at prices between 60 and 80% below actual market value. Everyone accompanied by forged transfer documents bearing the notarized approval of a federal official operating under Judge Whitfield's authority. But the most significant discovery came on the third afternoon. Wren was studying a geological survey map that Stillwell had included in his notebook when she went very still. Elliot, look at this. He leaned over her shoulder. The map showed the subsurface geology of the Bitterroot Valley annotated in a hand that was neither Stillwell's nor Penderton's. Professional, technical, the work of a trained geologist. Copper deposits, Wren said. Her finger traced a shaded region that extended beneath virtually the entire valley floor. Massive copper deposits. And look where the highest concentration is. Her finger stopped on a spot that Elliot recognized immediately. The Hargrove property. He is not buying land for a railroad, Elliot breathed. He is buying a copper mine. The railroad is a cover story. Wren's face was pale in the lamplight. Pa knew that is what he meant. The thing under the ground that Penderton wanted. Pa must have found copper somewhere on our land. Every rancher in this valley is sitting on a fortune, Elliot said. and Penderton is stealing it from them for pennies. Cora had been listening from the doorway. Her face was white with rage. He killed Pa for copper. He murdered our father so he could dig metal out of the ground. We do not know that for certain, Jess said from the corner where she had been cleaning tack. But her voice held no conviction. She knew. They all knew. I know it, Stillwell said quietly from the kitchen doorway. Cora spun, reaching for the nearest weapon. Jess stepped between them. Talk, Jess commanded. Stillwell entered the room slowly. He looked older than he had 3 days ago, as if confession had aged him rather than relieved him. Your father, Hank Hargrove, found copper ore in the creek bed on the eastern boundary of your property. He brought a sample to the assayer's office in Copper Bluff last spring. The assayer works for Penderton. Within a week, Penderton knew. He approached the doorway but did not enter. He sent men to your ranch to negotiate. Your father refused. We know that part, Cora said through her teeth. What you do not know is that Penderton did not order the barn fire. That was Marcus Vane's initiative. Vane believed that a show of force would convince your father to sell. When it led to your father's death instead, Penderton was furious. Not because a man had died, but because a dead man could not sign a deed of sale. The room went cold. So they switched to taxes, Elliot said, understanding, clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. If they could not buy the land, they would take it through the legal system. Inflate the taxes, wait for the family to fail, then purchase the land at auction. For a fraction of its true value, Stillwell confirmed. With no witnesses and no opposition. Jess stood very still for a long moment. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the mountains that had been her family's home for 20 years. We are not losing this land, she said. Her voice was quiet and absolute, the voice of bedrock. We are not losing it to taxes. We are not losing it to Penderton. We are not losing it to anyone. She turned back to the room. What do we need? Elliot took a breath. We need 3 things. First, Stillwell's notebook needs to be corroborated with original documents from Penderton's office. A notebook alone is the testimony of a confessed forger. We need physical evidence. Second, we need witnesses. Other ranchers who were threatened, cheated, or coerced. Their testimony combined with documentary evidence creates a case that no court can ignore. And third, we need to get this evidence to a federal marshal, not the local sheriff. Federal authority, someone beyond Penderton's reach. Wren was already thinking. Nell Bridger, she said. She works as a filing clerk at the bank in Copper Bluff. Penderton keeps his office on the 2nd floor. Nell and I grew up together before Pa pulled us up the mountain. Can she be trusted? Wren hesitated. She is kind, she is smart, and Penderton treats her terribly. She looked at Jess. I think she would help if she understood what was at stake. Then you go to town, Jess said. Talk to Nell. Find out what she knows and what she can access. She turned to Elliot. You go to the county office again. File the tax challenge formally. Make noise, make them nervous. Nervous people make mistakes, Cora stepped on forward. And what about us? You and I stay here. Jess met her youngest sister's eyes. Guard the ranch, guard Stillwell, and send word to the Gallagher place. If we are building an alliance, we start with our closest neighbors. They moved out the next morning before dawn, splitting in 3 directions like spokes of a wheel. Wren rode down to Copper Bluff to find Nell Bridger. Elliot took the mule toward the county office. Jess and Cora stayed behind with Stillwell and began the work of reaching out to neighboring ranchers. Wren found Nell in the small boarding house where she rented a room above a dry goods store. Nell Bridger was 23, small-framed, with quick, dark eyes and fingers stained with ink. She startled when she opened the door and found Wren Hargrove standing there. They had not spoken in nearly 3 years. Wren, her voice was uncertain. What are you doing here? I need your help, Nell, and I need to tell you something about your employer that you may already suspect. They talked for an hour. Nell listened with the focused attention of a woman who had been waiting for someone to confirm what she already feared. She had seen the discrepancies in the ledgers. She had noticed that filed prices never matched the figures Penderton discussed in meetings. She had heard conversations through thin office walls that made her skin crawl. I thought about going to the sheriff, Nell said. But Mr. Vane told me, once casual-like, that the sheriff owed Mr. Penderton a great deal of money and a great deal of loyalty. She twisted her hands together. I am the only income my grandmother has. If I lose this position, we have nothing. You will not lose anything, Wren promised. But we need information. Transaction records. Filed prices compared to actual prices. Anything that shows Penderton is falsifying documents. Nell was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "There is a telegraph office in town. Old Mr. Fletcher runs the night shift. He is 70 years old and he hates Penderton because Penderton tried to buy his house and Fletcher told him to go to hell." She looked at Wren with something that was half fear and half determination. "If I copy the records, could Fletcher telegraph them somewhere safe? Somewhere Penderton cannot reach?" Wren felt hope ignite in her chest like a struck match. "Yes, Fort Missoula, the federal marshal's office. If we can get the evidence there, Penderton loses all his protection." Nell nodded slowly. "Give me 3 days. I will write down everything I can. Prices, dates, account numbers." She paused. "But Wren, you need to know something. Mr. Penderton has been meeting with someone, a man who comes from the east on the train. I have seen official government seals on the letters they exchange. Whoever this man is, he is powerful. More powerful than Penderton, Judge Aldrich Whitfield." Wren said. Nell's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Because we have a witness." Wren squeezed her friend's hand. 3 days, Nell, and be careful." While Wren worked in town, Elliot returned to the county tax office to file the formal challenge. The thin clerk with the spectacles received him with visible unease and accepted the paperwork with the enthusiasm of a man handling a venomous snake. Elliot was walking back to his mule when the sound of approaching hooves made him stop. Tommy Gallagher came around the corner at a gallop, his horse lathered and blowing. The boy was 13, tall for his age, with the kind of face that had not yet decided whether it belonged to a child or a man. Right now, it belonged to neither. It belonged to someone terrified. "Mr. Crane!" He pulled up hard, the horse dancing sideways. "You have to come. My pa. Penderton's men came last night. They burned the fence line, and when Pa tried to stop them, they beat him. He beat him bad. Ma sent me to find help because—" His voice broke. He was shaking so hard the saddle creaked. Elliot's stomach dropped. "How far?" "5 miles. North along the creek." Tommy's eyes were red. "Please, sir. Pa cannot get up. There is blood everywhere, and Ma does not know what to do." Elliot was on the mule before conscious thought caught up with the decision. He knew even as he kicked the animal into motion that a mule would not get him there fast enough. He knew that he had no medical supplies, no weapons, no experience with frontier violence. He knew that riding toward a ranch that had just been attacked by Penderton's hired men was probably the most dangerous thing he had ever done. He went anyway. They reached the Gallagher ranch in just under an hour. The smell reached them first. Burned wood, scorched earth, the acrid bite of destruction. The fence line along the eastern boundary was a skeleton of charred posts and smoldering wire. Cattle milled in confused clusters where the containment had been broken. Inside the small cabin, Seamus Gallagher lay on the floor where he had fallen. His wife, Ruth, knelt beside him, pressing a blood-soaked cloth to his head. Seamus was a big man, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked like he could carry a house on his back. Now he looked broken. 2 eyes swollen shut, blood caking his beard. The sound of his breathing was wrong, shallow and wet and labored. Elliot knelt beside him. His mother had been a nurse. She had taught him things in the evenings after her hospital shifts, practical things, the kind of knowledge that she said every person should have, because you never knew when the nearest doctor would be too far away. He checked the injuries with hands that were steady, despite the fear roaring through him. Cracked ribs, at least 3. Deep laceration above the left eye, extensive bruising across the torso and back. The wet breathing suggested possible internal complications, though Elliot could not be certain. "He needs a real doctor," Elliot said. "Nearest one is in Copper Bluff," Ruth whispered. 4 hours ride. I cannot leave him. I cannot leave the children." Cora was already moving toward the door. Jess had sent both sisters to the Gallagher place when Tommy's message reached the ranch, and they had arrived minutes after Elliot. Now Cora's face was set with the particular determination of someone who has already made a decision and is merely informing the world of it. "I will go. I am the fastest rider here." Jess grabbed her arm. "No, it is too dangerous. Penderton's men could still be out there. Then I am exactly the person who should go." Cora pulled free, "Because I am the only one they cannot catch." She was on her horse and gone before Jess could argue. Tommy followed her to the porch, watching her disappear into the darkness with wide eyes. "She is really fast," he said. Elliot turned back to Seamus, working with what he had: clean water, torn cloth, steady hands. He cleaned the wounds, applied pressure to the worst of the bleeding, improvised a binding for the cracked ribs using strips torn from his own shirt. Ruth watched him with eyes that held both gratitude and devastation. 4 men, she said. They came after dark, told Seamus he had 2 days to reconsider selling. When he said no, they just started. She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Did you recognize any of them? The foreman, big man with a scar across his chin, works for Penderton directly. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. They said next time they would burn the whole place, with us inside. Elliot felt something crystallize inside him, something cold and precise and unbreakable. He had spent 2 years running from a fight he did not start. He had let guilt and grief and fear drive him across a continent. He had allowed other men's cruelty to define the boundaries of his life. No more. Mrs. Gallagher, he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. She looked at him. Do you have any letters from Penderton? Any written threats? Any documents related to his attempts to buy your land? Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she stood crossed to a wooden chest in the corner and opened it. Inside were bundles of letters tied with string. Every letter he ever sent us. Every threat. Seamus wanted to burn them. I said we might need them someday. She met Elliot's eyes. I was right, was I not? You were right. Cora rode hard through the mountain night, pushing her horse down trails she had memorized since childhood. She was 2 miles from Copper Bluff when she heard them behind her. 2 riders moving fast, gaining on the straightaways. Hargrove girl, one of them shouted, Stop! We just want to talk. Cora did not stop. She veered off the main trail onto a narrow path that hugged the edge of a cliff face, a path so treacherous that only someone who had ridden it 100 times in daylight would dare attempt it in darkness. The riders behind her hesitated. She heard their horses skid, heard cursing, heard hooves scrambling on loose rock. They did not follow. She reached Copper Bluff with her horse lathered and blowing, found Dr. Colton Marsh had a small office and pounded on the door until a young man with sleep-creased cheeks and startled eyes opened it. Dr. Colton Marsh arrived 4 hours later, riding hard beside Cora. He was young, late 20s, with the kind of earnest face that inspired trust and the kind of hands that inspired confidence. He examined Seamus with quick, practiced movements. Cracked ribs not broken. Severe contusions. The head wound needs stitching. He looked at Elliot. Your field treatment was sound. Possibly saved his life. Where did you learn wound care? My mother was a nurse. Marsh stitched the wound, bound the ribs properly, and administered laudanum for the pain. When he was finished, he drew Elliot aside. This is the 4th rancher I have treated in 3 months, he said quietly. All beaten, all after refusing to sell to Penderton. I have documented every injury, detailed notes, sketches, descriptions of the wounds consistent with systematic assault by multiple assailants. Elliot's pulse quickened. Would you be willing to share those records for a legal case? Marsh looked at him steadily. I have been waiting for someone to ask me that question since the first time I stitched up a man who was beaten for refusing to sell his home. His jaw tightened. Yes, I will share everything, and I will testify if it comes to that. They rode back to the Hargrove Ranch as dawn was breaking. Elliot was so exhausted he could barely stay upright on the mule. His shirt was gone, torn into bandages. His hands were stained with another man's blood. His body ached in places he did not know could ache. Jess was waiting on the porch. She saw him coming up the trail, and her expression went through something Elliot did not have the energy to analyze. She met him in the yard, took the mule's reins, and looked at his ruined clothes and blood-stained hands. Gallagher, she said. It was not a question. 4 of Penderton's men beat him half to death. His wife and son were inside listening to it happen. Jess's face went still, the kind of stillness that comes before storms. Dr. Marsh has medical records, Elliot continued. Ruth Gallagher has letters, written threats from Penderton, and she wants to help. Jess was quiet for a long moment. Then she said Cora rode to the Holloway place on the way back. They have agreed to share their stories too. She paused. Penderton threatened them all. Broken fences, scattered herds, poisoned wells. The Holloways lost 30 head of cattle in a single night when someone cut their wire and drove the herd into a ravine. How many families? Total 7 so far, including us. It is enough. If they all testify, if we combine their accounts with Stillwell's notebook and the documents Nell is copying, we have a case that a federal court cannot ignore. Jess looked at him. Her green eyes were unreadable. You should sleep, she said. I need to organize the documents. Prepare a formal complaint. You need to sleep. Her voice carried an authority that Elliot in his current state lacked the strength to resist. Everything else can wait until you are not about to fall over. She was right. He barely made it to the barn before his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the horse blankets and was unconscious before his head settled. He woke to the sound of horses and angry voices. The afternoon sun was cutting through the barn door in golden shafts. Elliot sat up disoriented, heart hammering. Outside, men were talking. One voice he recognized immediately, Marcus Vane. He pulled on his boots and moved to the barn door. From the shadow of the doorway, he could see the yard. Vane stood near the corral, flanked by two men on horseback who wore the hard expressions and holstered pistols of hired guns. Facing them on the porch stood Jess, Cora, and Wren, arranged in a line that looked like it had been carved from the mountain itself. Miss Hargrove, Vane's voice was silk over steel. Mr. Penderton sends his regards. He is aware that a Mr. Robert Stillwell has taken up residence at your ranch. Mr. Stillwell is in possession of certain property belonging to Mr. Penderton. A notebook. We would like it returned. Jess did not blink. I do not know anyone by that name. Come now. Vane smiled his glass smile. We have reliable information that Stillwell arrived here 4 nights ago. We also know that Mr. Crane has been visiting neighboring ranches gathering documents and testimony. He tilted his head. Mr. Penderton is a patient man, but patience, as I mentioned to Mr. Crane previously, has its limits. Then your boss should learn some. Cora's voice was a blade. He has been terrorizing this valley for 2 years. Burning fences, beating men, stealing land. Maybe his patience should have run out before he started acting like a common thug. Vane's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. Young lady, you have spirit. Your father had spirit too. The temperature on that porch dropped 20 degrees. Do not, Jess said, and her voice was a sound Elliot had never heard from a human throat before, low and dangerous and vibrating, with something that was beyond anger. Do not speak about our father. Vane seemed to realize he had crossed a line. He adjusted his cuffs. Very well, allow me to deliver the rest of my message. He looked at each sister in turn. The tax deadline is 45 days away. $340. If it is not paid, this property will be seized. Mr. Penderton will purchase it at auction. And there is nothing, he emphasized the word with quiet precision, that any notebook or any testimony or any mail-order accountant from Philadelphia can do to change that. He turned to leave, then stopped. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Mr. Crane, I know you are listening. Elliot stepped out of the barn shadow. Vane tossed the envelope at his feet. A gift from Mr. Penderton. Something to help you reconsider your priorities. Then he mounted his horse and rode away with his escorts, leaving dust and silence. Elliot picked up the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a letter. The photograph showed Judge Howard Crane lying in a hospital bed, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow, his body visibly diminished. The man who had once commanded courtrooms with his voice and his intellect was reduced to a figure made of paper and shadow. The letter was brief. Judge Crane is dying, liver failure, 6 months at most. He has expressed a wish to see you before the end. If you leave Montana immediately, you may arrive in time to say goodbye. Elliot stared at the photograph. His hands did not shake. They had gone beyond shaking into a stillness that was worse. The 4 of them stood in the kitchen that evening while the light died outside and the mountains turned to silhouettes. Stillwell had been moved to the root cellar for his own protection. The notebook was hidden in a place only the sisters knew. Elliot laid the photograph on the table. They all looked at it. You should go, Jess said. He looked up at her. Her face was set in that expression he had come to know, the one that showed nothing and meant everything. He is dying, she continued. You owe him. Whatever happened in Philadelphia, whatever your testimony did or did not do, he was your employer. He trusted you. And if Stillwell is telling the truth, he was innocent. A dying innocent man wants to see you. She met his eyes. You should go. Cora was uncharacteristically quiet. Wren watched Elliot with those amber eyes that saw too much. And this ranch, Elliot asked? And the evidence in the 45 days we handled everything before you came. We will handle it after you leave. The words were matter of fact. They were also Elliot understood a door being held open. Jess was giving him permission to leave. More than permission. She was giving him an excuse wrapped in logic, delivered with the practiced detachment of a woman who had learned very young that wanting people to stay was a weakness she could not afford. He looked at the photograph again. Judge Crane's hollow eyes stared up at him from the paper. No, Elliot said. The word surprised everyone in the room, including himself. For 2 years, he continued slowly, I have been running. Running from Philadelphia. From the trial. From what I did. He touched the edge of the photograph. I thought coming to Montana was running towards something new, but it was still running, just in a different direction. He looked up at Jess. I cannot change what happened to Judge Crane. I cannot give him back the years that were stolen from him. And going to his bedside will not undo the testimony I gave. But what I can do, the only thing I can do that matters, is make sure the truth comes out. That Whitfield is exposed. That Penderton is stopped. That the evidence in Stillwell's notebook reaches the people who can act on it. He straightened. That evidence does not just save this ranch. It does not just stop a land thief. It proves that Judge Howard Crane was innocent. It proves that everything that was done to him, to me, to all of us, was manufactured by Whitfield and his partners. His voice was steady now, steadier than it had been in years. If I leave, I might reach Judge Crane in time to say I am sorry. But if I stay, I can do something better than apologize. I can clear his name. I can make sure the world knows what was done to him. And I can make sure the men who did it pay for it. He met Jess's eyes. So no, I am not leaving, not until this is finished. The kitchen was silent. Wind pressed against the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth. Then Jess did something Elliot had never seen her do. She smiled. Not a large smile, not a warm smile, but a real one, small and fierce like a flame cupped in the palm of a hand. All right, she said, then we had better get to work. The next 5 days moved with the concentrated intensity of a river narrowing before rapids. Every hour counted, every action carried weight. Nell Bridger sent word through Wren that she had completed her records. Transaction dates, filed prices, actual prices, count numbers, everything she could extract from Penderton's files without being detected. She had written it all in a small, neat hand on sheets of onion skin paper thin enough to fold into a letter. Dr. Marsh delivered his medical records to the ranch personally, riding up the mountain trail on a Sunday when his absence from town would not be noticed. He brought documentation of 4 separate assaults complete with anatomical sketches of the injuries and signed statements from the victims. Ruth Gallagher sent her bundle of threatening letters through Tommy, who rode like the wind and arrived grinning despite the danger. The Holloway family provided a copy of their original deed alongside the forged deed that Penderton had filed with the county, showing 40 acres added, that had never belonged to the transaction. Elliot organized everything. He cross-referenced dates, verified signatures, built a chronological narrative of fraud and violence that stretched back 2 years and implicated Penderton, Vane, and Whitfield in a conspiracy that spanned from Montana to Washington. Wren worked beside him through every evening, learning the language of legal documents the way she had learned the language of the mountain through immersion and fierce attention. She was, Elliot realized, extraordinarily intelligent, the kind of intelligence that had been starved of material and was now devouring everything it could reach. You should have been a lawyer, he told her one night. She looked up from a deed of transfer, a smudge of ink on her cheek. Women cannot be lawyers, not yet, but the world changes. And when it does, it will need people like you. Wren smiled, quick and surprised, as if she had been given a gift she did not expect. On the 6th night, Elliot and Wren prepared for the most dangerous part of the plan. Penderton's office above the bank contained the original documents, the physical evidence that would transform Stillwell's testimony from the word of a confessed forger into an airtight prosecution. Without those originals, a clever defense attorney could argue that the notebook was fabricated. With them, the case was unassailable. The plan was straightforward. Enter the office at night, locate the safe, remove the documents, leave. The execution was terrifying. They rode down the mountain trail in darkness, leaving the horses tied a mile from town and approaching on foot. Copper Bluff at midnight was a ghost of its daytime self. Windows dark, streets empty. The only sound was the wind moving through the gaps between buildings like breath through teeth. Wren led the way. She knew the town from childhood before her father had retreated to the mountain. She moved through the shadows with the same silent economy she brought to everything, placing each foot with precision, her body low and fluid. They reached the bank building. The exterior staircase to the second floor was wooden old, and Elliot was certain it would announce their presence to every soul in a mile radius. But Wren had thought of this. She pointed to the edges of the steps. Walk where the wood meets the wall. Less creak. They climbed in silence. At the top, Elliot examined the lock. A simple mechanism, the kind he had encountered many times at Alderton and Associates, where Judge Crane had a habit of locking himself out of his own office at least twice a week. Elliot had learned to pick it with a letter opener. A bent piece of wire served the same purpose. The lock clicked. The door opened. They slipped inside and eased the door shut. Wren struck a match, lit a candle stub, shielded the flame with her hand. The office materialized around them in fragments of gold light. Heavy desk, leather chairs, maps on the walls showing railroad routes and property boundaries. And in the far corner, a cast-iron safe the size of a small wardrobe. There, Elliot whispered. He knelt before the safe. His hands were slick. His heart was a drum corps performing at double time. He had never cracked a safe in his life, but he had read about it because Elliot Crane had read about nearly everything, and the theoretical knowledge now wrestled with the practical reality of his trembling fingers on the dial. 5 minutes. 10. The numbers refused to align. Sweat ran down his temples. Then Wren knelt beside him. She placed her ear against the safe door. Turn it slowly, she whispered. I will listen. You can hear the tumblers. I can hear a mouse walking on pine needles from 50 yards. I think I can hear a safe mechanism. Elliot turned the dial, slowly, deliberately. Wren's eyes were closed, her head tilted, every fiber of her being focused on the infinitesimal clicks inside the iron door. Stop. Back 2. Forward 1. Sean, stop. The safe opened with a sound like a swim. Inside were stacks of documents, leather folders, metal boxes. Elliot began pulling them out, spreading them on the desk where the candlelight fell. His trained eyes scanned with desperate efficiency. Land deeds, transfer papers, financial records, and there, a bundle of letters tied with red string, official letterhead, the Department of the Interior, signed by Judge Aldrich Whitfield. Elliot's hands went numb as he read. The letters authorized Penderton's land acquisitions. They provided federal approval for right-of-way claims that did not exist. They referenced payments to a numbered account in a partnership agreement that spelled out the division of profits from what the letters called mineral extraction rights. He is not just approving the sales, Elliot breathed. Whitfield is a full partner. He profits from every acre Penderton steals. Wren was already committing the pages to memory. She read each page once, her amber eyes moving with the speed and precision of a printing press, absorbing details that her extraordinary mind would hold with perfect fidelity. The geological survey, she said, pulling a large folded document from the bottom of the safe. Look, copper deposits confirmed, estimated value $2 million. She looked at Elliot. Our land alone is worth more than everything Penderton has offered every rancher in this valley combined. Footsteps on the stairs. They both froze. The candle flame guttered in a draft from somewhere. Footsteps deliberate and unhurried ascending the exterior staircase. I thought I saw light, a voice said outside the door. Marcus Vane. His tone was conversational, almost amused. Someone is working late. Elliot grabbed the documents, shoved them inside his coat. Wren pinched the candle flame dead. Darkness crashed down like a wave. The doorknob turned. Wren seized Elliot's arm and pulled him toward the rear window. She had already scouted the escape route. The window opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the building's back wall, and below that was a 12-foot drop into the alley. The door opened. Lamplight spilled in. Vane's shadow stretched across the floor. Wren went through the window first, quick and silent as a cat. Elliot followed with considerably less grace, barking his shin on the window frame, biting down on the pane. Behind them, Vane's voice sharpened. The safe is open. He is here. Elliot dropped from the ledge. The impact jarred through his ankles and knees. Wren caught his arms, steadied him, and then they were running through the alley, through shadows, through the sleeping town. They were 2 streets away when a crash erupted from behind the bank building. The sound of a horse panicking hooves slamming against stall walls, a commotion loud enough to wake the dead. Cora, she had followed them. Elliot should have known. The youngest Hargrove sister had trailed them down the mountain, positioned herself near the bank's stable, and when she heard Vane's voice, she had created a diversion. They met at the edge of town, all three breathing hard, Cora grinning like a wildcat. "You are welcome," she said. "You were supposed to stay at the ranch," Wren hissed, "and you were supposed to be the smart one." Cora swung onto her horse. "Yet here you are sneaking into buildings at midnight without backup." They rode hard up the mountain trail, the documents pressed against Elliot's chest like a second heartbeat. Behind them, Copper Bluff was waking up, lanterns flickering to life, voices calling in the darkness. They made it back to the ranch just before dawn. Jess was on the porch, rifle across her lap, and the look she gave all three of them could have curdled milk at 40 paces. But before she could speak, Elliot pulled the documents from his coat and laid them on the porch rail. "We have everything," he said. "Federal correspondence, financial records, the geological survey. Whitfield signed authorization of every fraudulent transaction in this valley." Jess looked at the papers. She looked at her sisters, windblown and exhilarated. She looked at Elliot, disheveled and trembling, and alive. "And what now?" she said. "Now we get it to Fort Missoula. Federal Marshal, the only authority Penderton cannot buy." "The Telegraph," Wren said. "Nell and Mr. Fletcher. If we send the critical details by wire tonight, the Marshal could have it by morning." "Do it," Jess said. But as the sun rose and they began to plan, Cora came running from the barn. "Stillwell is gone," she said. Her face was white. "And so is the notebook." In the early light, they found the note pinned to the barn door. The handwriting was not Stillwell's. It was printed in block letters, precise and impersonal. "Your ranch burns Tuesday night. Leave now or burn with it. This is your only warning." It was signed with a single letter. P. Jess read it once. She folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. Then she looked at the mountains at the morning light, touching the peaks with gold, at the land her father had loved enough to die for. "We are not leaving," she said. And somewhere below the mountain, Silas Penderton was preparing for war. The morning after they found the note, Elliot stood in the kitchen staring at the empty space where Stillwell's coat had hung on the wall peg. The coat was gone. The boots were gone. But Stillwell's personal effects remained on the shelf beside his cot in the barn. A comb with 3 broken teeth, a pouch of tobacco, a handful of coins, $7.40, which was everything the old man had carried with him across 1,000 miles of guilt. "A man running takes his money," Elliot said. Jess was loading the Winchester at the kitchen table, her movements precise and mechanical. The movements of someone who had loaded that rifle so many times her hands could do it without her mind's participation. She did not look up. "A man running also takes his shoes," she said. "He was not running, he was taken. Or he was bought." Jess's voice carried the flat finality of a woman who had been betrayed enough times to expect it. Penderton offered him something. Money, safety, a way out. And Stillwell took it because that is what liars and forgers do. They save themselves. Wren came in from the porch, her face drawn from a sleepless night. She had spent the hours since the discovery examining every inch of the barn, the yard, the trail leading down the mountain. Now she laid something on the table. Boot prints, 2 sets beside Stillwell's, coming from the eastern tree line. She looked at her sisters. They did not use the main trail. They came through the old logging road that Pa blocked off years ago. Someone moved those logs. Cora was pacing the room like something caged. "So they took him. Fine, that means Penderton has the notebook. Our best evidence. Not our only evidence." Elliot forced his voice to remain steady despite the dread coiling in his stomach. "We still have the documents from his office. We have Nell's records, Dr. Marsh's medical reports, the Gallagher letters, the Holloway deed forgery. The notebook was important, but it was not everything. It was the backbone," Jess said. Without Stillwell's testimony, the notebook was just a ledger. Without the notebook, Stillwell's testimony is just the word of a confessed criminal. Elliot knew she was right. The legal architecture of their case had just lost its central pillar. A competent defense attorney in Penderton could afford the most competent attorneys in the territory would dismantle witness testimony without documentary corroboration. The physical documents from Penderton's office proved fraud, but they did not prove the direct connection to Whitfield that Stillwell's notebook had established. They had 48 hours before the threatened attack. They had evidence that was strong but incomplete. And somewhere below the mountain, a man with money men and malice was preparing to take everything they had. Elliot sat down at the table across from Jess. She looked up from the rifle. Their eyes met. "We send the telegraph today," he said. "Everything we have." Nell and Fletcher transmit to Fort Missoula in Kansas City simultaneously. Even without the notebook, the federal correspondence from Penderton's safe directly implicates Whitfield. His signature, his seal, his handwriting. And if the marshal does not come in time, then we hold this ranch until he does. We. Jess's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something closer to the expression a wolf makes before it decides whether to fight or retreat. "You keep saying we, city boy." It was the first time she had used Cora's nickname for him, and it did not sound like mockery. It sounded like something else entirely. "Because it is," we, Elliot said, "whether you like it or not." Jess held his gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then she stood, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and walked to the door. Cora, ride to the Gallaghers. Tell every family in this valley to be here by sundown." She looked back at Elliot. "Ren, take Elliot to town. Get that telegraph sent. And be back before dark." She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, tall and straight and immovable as the mountains behind her. "We are not losing this land," she said. "Not today. Not ever." Ren and Elliot rode down the mountain in the sharp clarity of early morning. The aspens along the trail had begun to turn gold and amber, trembling against the deep green of the pines. The beauty of it struck Elliot with unexpected force. He had spent weeks on this mountain, and somewhere between the terror and the exhaustion and the work the land had seeped into him. The smell of pine resin in the morning. The way the light changed on the peaks hour by hour, painting them in colors that had no names. The sound of the creek running over the stones, constant and patient. The sound of time itself moving through the valley. He understood suddenly and completely why Hank Hargrove had refused to sell, why he had died rather than surrender this place. It was not stubbornness or pride. It was love. The deep, quiet, unshakable love of a man for the ground beneath his feet. Ren spoke beside him, her voice low. "You are thinking about something." "I am thinking that I understand your father." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Pa would have liked you. He always said a man who could read was a man worth knowing." She paused. "He would have been furious about the mail order husband advertisement, though. Would have chased you off the mountain with a shotgun." Elliot managed a small laugh. "Your sister nearly accomplished that on his behalf." "Jess is afraid," Ren said. "Not of Penderton, not of losing the ranch. She is afraid of needing someone. She has been taking care of Cora and me since Pa died. She has been the wall between us and everything that wants to hurt us. And walls do not ask for help." She looked at Elliot with those amber eyes that missed nothing. "But you are already in, whether she admits it or not." Elliot did not know how to respond to that. So he focused on the trail ahead and tried not to think about the way Jess had looked at him in the kitchen that morning, or the way his chest had ached when she called him we. They reached Copper Bluff at mid-morning. Nell Bridger was waiting behind the dry goods store, her face pale but determined. She had a sheaf of onion skin papers folded into the lining of her coat. "Everything I could copy," she said. 2 weeks of records. Prices, dates, accounts." She handed them to Ren. "And something else," she lowered her voice. "Penderton sent 2 men north toward Missoula yesterday evening. I think they were carrying messages. Penderton himself stayed in town with Vane and the rest of his crew. They have been gathering more men, hired guns from the mining camps. I counted at least a dozen coming and going from his office this week." Elliot's blood chilled. Penderton was preparing for something larger than a simple ranch raid. He was assembling an army. They moved to the telegraph office. Old Mr. Fletcher was exactly as Nell had described him. 70 years old, white-bearded, with hands that trembled from age but eyes that burned with the particular fury of a man who had lived long enough to despise injustice. "Penderton tried to buy my house," Fletcher said, pulling his telegraph key toward him with practiced ease. "Offered me $50 for a property worth $300. When I told him where he could put his $50, he had the sheriff come around and suggest that my operating license might be reviewed. He cracked his knuckles. Send your message. I will put it through on the federal wire myself. Government priority. Go straight to the marshal's office. Elliot had spent the previous night composing the telegraph. It was, by necessity, compressed every word chosen for maximum information density. He had distilled their entire case into a message that would fit the constraints of the wire while conveying the urgency and scope of the conspiracy. Fletcher began transmitting. The key clicked in the quiet office, sharp and rhythmic. Each click a syllable of evidence traveling through copper wire across hundreds of miles to a desk in Fort Missoula, where someone with authority and integrity might, if everything went right, read it and act. The transmission took 40 minutes. When it was finished, Fletcher sat back and nodded. Sent. Both destinations. Fort Missoula and the federal prosecutor's office in Kansas City. He looked at Elliot. Now you pray that someone on the other end gives a damn. Elliot looked at Wren. She looked at him. There was nothing left to do but go back up the mountain and prepare for whatever came next. They were halfway up the trail when Wren pulled her horse to a stop. Listen, she said. Elliot listened. At first he heard nothing but the wind in the creek. Then faintly from below and to the east, the sound of multiple horses moving at speed. Not on the main trail, on the old logging road. That is the route they used to take, Stillwell, Wren said. Her face had gone tight. They are coming up behind us. How many? Wren closed her eyes, listening the way she had listened to the safe tumblers with her whole body. 8, maybe 10. Moving fast. The attack was not coming Tuesday night. It was coming now. Penderton must have learned about the telegraph. They ran. There was no other word for it. Wren's horse knew the mountain trails the way a fish knows water. And Elliot's mule, sensing the urgency that transmitted itself through his clenched knees and rigid spine, found a gear that Elliot had not believed the animal possessed. They reached the ranch 20 minutes ahead of the riders. Jess was on the porch. She saw their faces and did not need to ask. How many, she said. 8 to 10, coming up the logging road. They will be here within the hour. Jess's expression did not change. She turned and walked inside. When she came back, she carried 3 rifles and a box of ammunition. Cora is not back yet, she said, nor the other families. It is just us. Just us. 2 women, 1 more somewhere on the mountain, and 1 accountant from Philadelphia who had never fired a gun in his life. Jess handed Elliot a rifle. He took it the way a man takes a live snake, with extreme care and visible discomfort. You ever shot one of these? Numma point that end at the target. Pull this, she indicated the trigger. Try not to aim at anything you want to keep alive. Jess positioned Wren at the upstairs window facing east, covering the logging road approach. She herself took the porch where she had a clear field of fire across the yard and toward the tree line. Elliot she placed behind the stone water trough, which provided cover and a line of sight toward the corral and the barn. Do not shoot unless I tell you, Jess said. And if I tell you to run, you run. I am not running. Elliot, I am not running, Jess. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, something she would not name, and he did not dare. Then she nodded once and turned away. The waiting was worse than anything Elliot had imagined. The mountain was silent. The afternoon light was golden and warm, the kind of light that made the world look like a painting. Wildflowers still bloomed in the meadow beyond the corral. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. It was, Elliot thought, an extraordinarily beautiful day to die. The riders came out of the tree line at 4 in the afternoon. There were 12 of them, more than Wren had estimated. They spread across the meadow in a loose line, like a net being drawn closed. Most were the kind of men that frontier voisins attracted, hard-faced, armed, working for pay rather than principle. At their center rode a man Elliot had not seen before but recognized immediately from description. Silas Penderton. He was 55, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been handsome once, and had settled into the heavy authority of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He wore a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and he sat his horse with the easy confidence of money and power. Beside him rode Marcus Vane, impeccable as always, looking entirely out of place in the wilderness, like a chess piece that had wandered onto the wrong board. Hargrove Penderton called. His voice carried across the clearing with the practiced projection of a man who had addressed boardrooms and courtrooms and always expected to be heard. This is your last chance. Come out. Hand over the documents you stole from my office, and we can end this without anyone getting hurt. Jess stood on the porch. She did not raise her rifle. She simply stood there, tall and straight, her shadow stretching long across the wooden boards. "You are on my land, Mr. Penderton, and you are not welcome here." Penderton's expression hardened. "Miss Hargrove, I am trying to be reasonable." "No, you are trying to steal what is ours, the way you stole the Gallagher Ranch and the Holloway Ranch and every other piece of ground in this valley." She paused. "The way you killed my father." The accusation hung in the mountain air like smoke. Several of Penderton's men shifted uncomfortably. Even hired guns had limits to what they were willing to ignore. "Your father's death was a tragic accident," Vane interjected smoothly. "My father's death was murder." Jess's voice did not waver. "Your men sabotaged the barn. Your men weakened the beam. And when my father fell, your men watched him die." "That is a serious accusation," Penderton said. "One you cannot prove." "Actually," a voice said from behind the line of riders, "she can." Every head turned. Robert Stillwell walked out of the eastern tree line. He was limping. His face bore bruises that were 2 days old, purple and green and swollen. His hands were bound in front of him with rope that he had clearly been working loose because the knots were frayed, and his wrists were raw and bleeding. But he was alive, and he was not alone. Behind him, emerging from the trees like ghosts, came Cora Hargrove on horseback. And behind Cora, in a line that stretched back into the forest, came the families of the Bitterroot Valley. Seamus Gallagher, bandaged and limping but upright, with Ruth beside him, and Tommy on a horse too big for him. The Brennans' father and 3 sons, all armed. The Holloways, the Mercers, the Davenports. Family after family riding out of the trees with rifles across their laps and the look of people who had decided finally and irrevocably to stop being afraid. Cora had not just ridden to the Gallaghers. She had ridden to every ranch in the valley. She had shown them the evidence. She had told them about the copper. She had told them about Penderton's plan to steal everything they had built and everything their land concealed. And then she had found Stillwell. He was being held in a line shack 4 miles east, she said later, her voice carrying the casual tone of someone describing a morning ride rather than a rescue mission. 2 guards. Neither one expected a 21-year-old girl with an axe and a very bad temper. Penderton's hired men looked at the assembled ranchers, at the rifles, at the hard faces of people who had been pushed past the breaking point of fear into something harder and more dangerous. The mathematics of the situation were changing rapidly. 12 hired guns against 30 armed settlers was not a calculation that favored the guns. Stillwell stepped forward. His voice carried across the meadow with surprising strength for a man who looked like he might collapse at any moment. "The notebook you took from me, the one you burned last night in your fireplace, was a copy. I made it the second night at the ranch while everyone slept. I could not tell anyone because if Penderton's men came and forced answers, what you did not know could not be beaten out of you. The original is in a safe location that you will never find." He looked at Penderton. "Every forged document, every payment to Whitfield, every fraudulent deed, every dollar you stole from these families, it is all recorded. And as of this morning, a full account has been transmitted by Federal Telegraph to the United States Marshal's Office at Fort Missoula and the federal prosecutor in Kansas City." Penderton's face went the color of old ash. "He is lying," Vane said quickly. "This man is a confessed forger. His testimony is worthless. His testimony is corroborated." Elliot replied, stepping out from behind the water trough with the rifle he did not know how to use and the voice of a man who had finally stopped being afraid. "By documents taken from your office bearing Judge Whitfield's signature and federal seal. By financial records copied from your bank ledgers showing discrepancies between filed and actual purchase prices. By medical records documenting the systematic assault of ranchers who refused to sell. By threatening letters written on your own stationery." He took a breath. "And all of that evidence has been transmitted by Federal Telegraph this morning." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elliot had ever heard. Penderton turned to Vane. His face had moved beyond anger into something that looked almost like bewilderment, the expression of a man who has always held all the cards and has suddenly realized the deck has been switched. "Is that possible?" he said. Vane's glass composure had finally cracked. His eyes were moving rapidly, calculating, and whatever calculation he was running, the answer was not in his favor. "We should leave," Vane said quietly. Penderton stared at him. "Leave now, before the marshal arrives. If we ride to Missoula, we can take the evening train west. By the time federal warrants are issued, we can be in California or Mexico or anywhere that is not here. I am not running from a pack of dirt farmers and a bookkeeper from Philadelphia. Pennerton's voice rose. I own this valley. I own the sheriff. I own the county assessor. I own half the territorial legislature. None of that matters if you are in a federal prison, Vane hissed. The hired men were already edging their horses backward. One turned and rode away without a word, then another. The dissolution was not dramatic. It was quiet and steady, the way water leaves a cracked vessel one drop at a time until there is nothing left. Within 3 minutes, Pennerton and Vane stood alone in the meadow surrounded by 30 armed settlers and the wreckage of an empire built on paper and violence. It was Jess who walked down from the porch and crossed the yard to stand in front of Pennerton's horse. She looked up at him, this man who had killed her father and stolen her neighbor's land and burned fences and beaten men and threatened children. She looked up at him with those forest green eyes that held no fear and no hatred and no mercy. Get off my land, she said. Pennerton looked at her. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been recognition of the kind of force that money could not buy and violence could not break. The force of a woman standing on ground that was hers by right and by blood, and by the unshakable conviction that some things were worth more than safety. Then he turned his horse and rode away. Vane followed, casting one last look over his shoulder that held the desperate calculation of a man already planning his next move. They did not get far. The sound of horses approaching from the south reached the clearing before the riders appeared. Federal Marshal James Beckett rode into the meadow at the head of a column of 6 deputies, their badges catching the late afternoon light. Fletcher's telegraph had reached Fort Missoula at noon. Marshal Beckett, who had been investigating rumors of land fraud in the Bitterroot Valley for months without sufficient evidence to act, had read the transmission, assembled his deputies, and ridden hard. He arrived to find Pennerton and Vane attempting to leave by the southern trail. His deputies intercepted them with the unhurried efficiency of men who had done this many times before. Silas Pennerton, Marcus Vane. Beckett's voice was calm and official and carried the weight of federal authority. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud against the United States, bribery of a federal officer, falsification of government records, and complicity in the commission of assault. He paused. I suspect the list will get longer. Pennerton said nothing. His face had gone completely blank, the face of a man watching his future close, like a door. Vane attempted to speak. He opened his mouth, drew breath for what would undoubtedly have been an eloquent legal argument, and was interrupted by Cora Hargrove riding up beside him. You talk too much, she said, and she reached over and removed his hat because it was an expensive hat and he did not deserve it. That evening, the clearing in front of the Hargrove Ranch house looked like something from a painting Elliot had seen once in a Philadelphia museum. A gathering of people in golden light, the mountains rising behind them, the sky turning colors that belonged to no palette on earth. Families who had been terrorized for months stood together and talked and laughed with the fragile, brilliant joy of people who had survived something they were not sure they would survive. Children ran between the adults, freed from the fear that had constrained their parents. Someone produced a fiddle and began to play a simple melody that wound through the evening air like a thread of silver. Dr. Marsh had arrived to check on Seamus Gallagher and stayed when he realized there was food and music and Cora Hargrove was present. He stood near the corral pretending to examine a horse, while Cora pretended not to notice him. The pretending was transparent enough to make Wren smile. Nell Bridger sat on the porch steps with Wren talking quietly, 2 friends reconnecting after years of separation, their voices carrying the intimate warmth of shared history and shared courage. Ruth Gallagher brought a pot of stew large enough to feed the entire valley, and nearly did. Tommy Gallagher challenged 3 other boys to a horse race and won by a length that grew longer with each retelling. Stillwell sat alone at the edge of the gathering. Marshal Beckett had taken his statement and informed him that he would need to surrender himself to federal custody within the week to face charges related to the Philadelphia forgeries. Stillwell had nodded with the calm acceptance of a man who had been carrying his punishment inside him for years and was relieved to finally set it down. Elliot brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside him. They will want your testimony, Elliot said, against Whitfield, against Pennerton, in Philadelphia and here. I know. Stillwell ate slowly, mechanically. I will give them everything. Names, dates, methods. All of it. He looked at Elliot. The bruises on his face were turning yellow at the edges. His eyes, which had been frantic with guilt and fear on the night he first appeared, were quiet now. I placed that advertisement because I needed you here, he said. Not because of your accounting skills, though those helped. Because you were the one person I knew who had been hurt by what I did and who might, despite that, be willing to help me make it right. I could not come to you in Philadelphia. Penderton had men watching me. If I had approached you directly, they would have known, and they would have silenced us both. I needed you to come here to this valley where you could see with your own eyes what they were doing. He paused. I was betting on your decency, Mr. Crane. And I was right. Elliot looked at his hands, the same hands that had once turned the pages of falsified ledgers in a Philadelphia courtroom, the same hands that had bandaged a beaten man's wounds, that had picked the lock on a crooked man's safe, that had held a rifle he did not know how to fire and stood behind a water trough and refused to run. You were right, he said, and he was surprised to find that the words did not taste like forgiveness or absolution, but simply like truth, plain and clean and sufficient. He found Jess on the far side of the house, away from the celebration, sitting on a fallen log with the Winchester across her knees. She was looking at the mountains. The last light was fading from the peaks, rose gold melting into violet, and the first stars were emerging in the eastern sky. Elliot sat beside her. Not close, not far, the middle distance that had become their language. They sat in silence for a long time. The fiddle music carried faintly from the other side of the house. A coyote called somewhere in the timber, answered by another and another, until the darkness was threaded with voices. Pa used to sit here, Jess said. Every evening, he would watch the light change on the mountains and say the same thing. Tomorrow is going to be a good day. She was quiet for a moment, even when it was not going to be a good day, even when the cattle were sick, or the winter was coming, or the money was gone. He said it every single time. Elliot said nothing. He understood that she was not talking to him. She was talking to the mountain and the memory and the grief that she had carried alone for 2 years because she was the wall, and walls did not crack. I never cried, she said, when he died. Cora cried for days. Wren went quiet the way she does. But I never cried because someone had to be strong, and that someone was always going to be me. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright in the failing light, and Elliot saw what was behind them. Not just strength, not just fierceness, but the exhaustion of a woman who had been holding up the sky and had never once been asked if her arms were tired. You do not have to hold everything alone anymore, Elliot said. I do not know how to stop, I know. He did not reach for her. He did not move closer. He simply sat beside her and let the words exist in the space between them. But you could try, one thing at a time, starting with letting someone else keep watch tonight so you can sleep. Jess looked at him for a long time. The stars were fully out now, that impossible Montana sky, and somewhere in the clearing a child laughed and the fiddle played on. You are staying, she said. It was not a question. If you will have me. The ranch needs an accountant. Elliot smiled. Is that a proposal? It is a statement of fact. She paused. The rest comes later. If you survive the winter. I survived Philadelphia. I survived your sister's horse. I survived Marcus Vane in a 12-foot jump from a window in a confrontation I was not qualified to participate in. I think I can survive a Montana winter. We will see about that, city boy. But she was smiling, really smiling. And Elliot felt something inside him, something that had been clenched tight for 2 years slowly and carefully and irreversibly release. The weeks that followed moved with the steady rhythm of a world putting itself back together. Marshal Beckett's deputies arrested the county tax assessor on charges of fraud and collusion. The inflated tax assessments for every property in the valley were voided. New assessments conducted by a federal auditor sent from Helena, they came back at fair market value. The Hargrove tax bill dropped from $340 to $190, and contributions from grateful neighboring families covered the balance within a week. Penderton's land purchases were investigated by the Territorial Attorney General. Every forged deed was invalidated. Every ranch that had been sold under duress was returned to its original owners. The shell company Penderton had used to launder the transactions was dissolved, its assets frozen. The geological survey was made public. The copper deposits beneath the Bitterroot Valley were confirmed at a value that made every rancher in the territory sit down hard. The families formed a cooperative mining company with shares distributed based on acreage. No one was getting rich overnight, but no one was going to lose their land ever again. Silas Penderton was tried in federal court in Helena. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Stillwell testified for 4 days, his precise records corroborating every charge. Nell Bridger testified about the discrepancies in the financial ledgers. Dr. Marsh presented his medical documentation. Ruth Gallagher read her threatening letters into the record in a voice that shook with anger and never once faltered. Elliott testified about the tax fraud, about the forged documents, about the connection between Penderton's methods in Montana and Whitfield's conspiracy in Philadelphia. He spoke clearly and calmly the way he had spoken in that Philadelphia courtroom years before, except this time he knew that every word he said was built on truth that no one had tampered with. Penderton was convicted on all counts. 20 years in federal prison. Marcus Vane received 12 years. Judge Aldrich Whitfield was arrested in Washington, tried separately, and sentenced to 15 years. The scandal made national newspapers. The Philadelphia papers ran corrections. Judge Howard Crane's name was cleared officially and publicly 3 months after the Montana trial. It was too late for the judge himself. Howard Crane died in a Philadelphia hospital on a Tuesday morning in December, 6 weeks after his exoneration. But he died knowing. A letter from Elliott had reached him 2 weeks before the end. In it, Elliott had written everything. The truth about Stillwell, the truth about Whitfield, the truth about the numbers that had been altered before they ever reached his desk. I did not lie in that courtroom, Elliott wrote, but I spoke a truth that had been manufactured to destroy you. I am sorry that I could not see it then. I am sorry that it took me this long to find the real truth. But I found it. And because of it, your name is clean. Your legacy is intact. And the men who did this to you will spend the rest of their lives paying for it. Judge Crane's reply arrived a week after his death. His daughter had found it on his nightstand, already sealed and addressed, and had mailed it as he clearly intended. Dear Elliott, it read, "You did nothing wrong. You never did anything wrong. You told the truth as you understood it, which is all any honest man can do. I never blamed you. I never could. You were always the best of us at Alderton and Associates, not because you were the smartest or the most ambitious, but because you were decent, and decency in the end is the only thing that matters. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. Now stop carrying guilt that was never yours and go build something good." Elliott read that letter sitting on the porch of the Hargrove Ranch house on a January evening, so cold the stars seemed to crackle in the sky. Jess sat beside him. She did not ask what the letter said. She simply sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and when he finished reading and his eyes were too blurred to see, she took his hand and held it. They stayed like that while the cold deepened and the fire inside threw warm light through the windows, and the mountains stood silent and eternal against the winter sky. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley the way spring comes to high country, slowly and then all at once. Snow retreated up the peaks. The creeks swelled with meltwater. Green pushed through brown in the meadows, tentative at first, then bold, then extravagant. Elliott Crane stood in the yard of the Hargrove Ranch on a morning in April and watched the valley come alive. He had survived the winter. Barely. There had been moments in January when the snow was 6 feet deep and the temperature dropped so far below zero that the concept of warmth seemed like a fairy tale when he had seriously questioned every decision that had led him to this mountain. But he had survived. He had learned to chop wood without injuring himself. He had learned to ride not well but adequately on a patient mare that Cora had selected for him with the words, "This one is too gentle to kill you." He had kept the books, filed the taxes correctly, managed the correspondence with the mining cooperative, and written letters to lawyers and judges and government officials until his hand cramped and his ink ran dry. And he had watched the Hargrove sisters bloom in ways he had not expected. Wren had begun writing, not just records and documents, but stories. The history of the valley, the history of the families who had settled it, the history of the fight against Penderton. She wrote in the evenings by lamplight, pages piling up on the kitchen table, and when Elliott read them, he found a voice that was precise and beautiful and entirely her own. She had written to a publisher in Helena. She was waiting to hear back. Elliott had no doubt about the answer. Cora had not exactly softened, because Cora softening was like a wildfire softening theoretically possible but difficult to observe at close range. But she had allowed Dr. Colton Marsh to visit the ranch on Sundays for what they both insisted were medical checkups, and everyone else recognized as courtship. Marsh brought books. Cora pretended not to be interested. Marsh read passages aloud. Cora pretended not to listen. The pretending had become so elaborate and transparent that even the horses seemed to be rolling their eyes. "If those two do not figure it out soon," Wren muttered to Elliot one Sunday, as they watched Cora and Marsh arguing about the proper treatment of a horse's sore hoof with an intensity that had nothing to do with horses, "I am going to lock them in the barn." And Jess was still Jess. She rose before dawn. She worked until dark. She carried the rifle everywhere. She made decisions with the swift certainty of a woman who had learned that hesitation costs lives. She was still strong, still fierce, still the center around which everything turned. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any single moment that could be pointed to and named. It had happened the way rivers carve canyons, not in upheaval, but through the patient, persistent pressure of presence. Elliot had simply been there. Every morning coffee ready, every evening reading aloud by the fire, every crisis standing beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, beside her. He never tried to lead her. He never tried to save her. He never tried to diminish the fierce, untamed strength that was the core of who she was. He simply stood next to it and was not afraid. One morning in March, he had found a cup of coffee sitting outside his door. Hot, fresh, made the way he liked it, strong with a pinch of cinnamon. He had stared at it for a long moment. Then he had picked it up and walked downstairs. And Jess was in the kitchen, and she did not look at him, and he did not mention it, and the next morning, there was another cup, and the morning after that, and every morning since. They had not kissed. They had not made declarations. They had not done any of the things that stories said people were supposed to do when they found each other. What they had done was build a life, side by side, day by day, argument by argument, silence by silence. They had built something out of work and trust and the stubborn refusal to be anywhere else. On that April morning, Elliot was standing in the yard watching the light change on the peaks. When Jess came out of the house, she walked to him and stood beside him. Their shoulders touched. "Elliot, yes, I have been thinking." "About what?" "About the advertisement. The one still well placed. The one that brought you here." "What about it?" "It said the family needed a man who could read and write and keep accounts." She paused. "It did not say anything about a husband." "No, it did not." Jess was quiet for a moment. The morning light was in her hair, turning the chestnut strands to bronze and copper. Her face, which had been hard and closed the first night he saw, it was open now, not soft, never soft, but open. Like a mountain pass in spring and the snow finally clears, and you can see through to the other side. "I think," she said carefully, "that the advertisement was wrong about one thing." "What thing?" She turned to face him. Her green eyes were fierce and tender and terrified and brave all at the same time. "It should have said husband." Elliot looked at her, Jessamine Hargrove, who had pointed a rifle at his chest the night they met, who had voted to send him away, who had called him city boy and given him impossible tasks and watched him fail at every single one, and somehow against every instinct in every wall she had built had let him stay. "Is that a proposal?" he said. "It is a job offer." Her mouth curved. "The proposal comes with it. Then I accept." "Good." She took his hand. "About time." From the upstairs window, Cora's voice carried down with the subtlety of a cannon. "Finally, took you too long enough. I was about to start throwing things." Wren's laugh followed warm and bright as the spring morning. Elliot stood in the yard of his home, holding the hand of the woman he loved on a mountain in Montana, surrounded by a family he had found by accident and kept by choice. The man who had arrived on a sway-backed mule with a battered suitcase and nothing left to lose had found against all probability and reason everything worth having. Behind him, the Bitterroot Mountains rose into a sky so blue it made the eyes ache. Ahead of him stretched a life he had never imagined, built on ground that was solid and true, earned not through money or power, but through the simple, extraordinary act of showing up and staying. His mother would have been proud. His father would have been astonished. Judge Howard Crane would have smiled that quiet, knowing smile and said, "I told you so." And somewhere in whatever place the dead go to watch the living make their way, Hank Hargrove looked down at his three daughters and the man they had led into their lives and their home and their hearts and said what he had always said every evening without fail. Tomorrow is going to be a good day.